Hannah stood on the far side of the gymnasium with her back against a basketball hoop that no longer touched the floor. The court had tilted sometime after 3 in the morning. Not physically, not in any way that made sense. The painted lines still ran straight under my boots, but the room had acquired the feeling of a hill, and all the cots had slid toward the east wall without moving an inch. People were clinging to bed frames, door handles, radiator pipes, anything fixed, as if the building had turned toward some unseen gravity. "Ryan," Hannah called, and her voice came from the emergency radio in my hand. At the same time, another Hannah stood beside me, whispering, "Don't answer her." I could see both of them clearly. One was exhausted, bloodless, terrified. The other had no condensation on her skin despite the cold and no shadow under the pulsing red exit sign. Then the thing in the center of the court turned its face toward me. It wore mine, not the face I had that night, the one I might have had in 10 years if I'd kept letting other people take the blame. The weight, the death. Older, calmer, empty. All around us, the shelter began speaking in our voices. And behind the folded bleachers, where Hannah had told me never to look, something said, very gently, "You can still survive this, if you stay quiet." 48 hours earlier, I took the overnight position, because nobody in the county wanted it, and because I needed a place where people asked fewer questions than they answered. The posting called it an emergency support role at a temporary mountain shelter, which made it sound cleaner than it was. The shelter sat above a washed-out county road, 40 miles from the nearest proper town, in a valley that lost radio reception every time the weather turned bad. It had been a community center once, then a winter medical annex. Then, a disaster housing facility was created, said after the state realized every flood, landslide, and storm in that region somehow left a pocket of people stranded in the same stretch of mountains. By the time I arrived, it was all 3 at once. Cots in the gym, exam beds in the old nurses' station, canned food stacked where a daycare used to be. I told them I had dispatcher experience and emergency logistics training. That much was true. I did not tell them that I'd left county dispatch under a cloud of administrative silence, so thick it felt louder than accusation. A year before that job, I had altered response prioritization for a friend who was already neck-deep in departmental misconduct. I did it with a few keystrokes and a lie to myself. I told myself it would buy him time, protect the department, and keep one ugly thing from ruining more lives. What it did was delay help to a domestic call that turned medical before deputies arrived. No one ever proved I had anything to do with it. The timestamps were muddied. The records were partial. The internal review died neatly. But I knew how long those extra minutes had been. I had heard it on the tape. The shelter administrator, a gaunt man named Mr. Voss, gave me a ring of labeled keys that looked older than the building, and a tour that felt less like orientation than a warning disguised as routine. The main dormitory is on the south side, medical wing off the central hall, cafeteria straight through the old recreation room, basement storage level below the boiler corridor, communications room upstairs, behind a steel door with a crank lock, old gymnasium at the north end, now overflow housing when storms push the numbers too high. He paused longest outside the gym. "We keep it for capacity only," he said. "If you don't need it, don't use it." There was no reason for that sentence to settle where it did, but it stayed with me. Maybe because his tone changed when he said it. Maybe because he didn't sound superstitious. He sounded tired. The first half of the shift was ordinary in the procedural way emergencies often were from a distance. Inventory, radio checks, coffee that tasted like wet cardboard. A handful of stranded utility workers are in the cafeteria. A mother and a little boy were sleeping in the dorm after a mudslide blocked the state route. Leon Doherty, a truck driver with a beard full of sleet and a laugh that made the fluorescent lights feel less harsh, sat at a folding table mending a ripped duffel strap with fishing line. Hannah Pike, a paramedic from one of the lower towns, Came in near dusk with 2 rescue volunteers and a split knuckle from trying to free a vehicle door. She had the hard, careful face of someone used to being the calmest person in a bad room. The weather turned fully at 9. It wasn't dramatic at first. Wind in the eaves. Then a hard rattle of sleet. Then, the rain was hitting the north windows sideways so fast it sounded like handfuls of gravel. Around 10:30, the county repeater died. After that, people started arriving in clusters. 2 evacuees from a creekside motel, an older woman named Rosa with an oxygen concentrator, and a suitcase full of pill bottles. A teenager called Nate who'd been separated from his uncle during a road closure. A volunteer fire captain named Daria, and a pair of forestry contractors who looked too exhausted to be frightened by anything. Every new arrival got the same manila welcome packet from the front desk basket: intake form, meal schedule, bedding assignment, emergency map, rules sheet. I only noticed the difference because Hannah frowned at hers and said, "This can't be right." I looked up from Leon's registration. "What?" She held out the page. "It says lights out after midnight in the dormitory. That can't be an emergency shelter rule." I almost laughed, because mine, given to me by Voss when I clocked in, said the opposite in block letters so plain they looked photocopied 1,000 times. "Keep dormitory lights on at all times." I took her sheet, same letterhead, same formatting, different instructions. I asked Leon for his. He produced a folded copy from his jacket pocket. His first listed rule read, "If you hear knocking from the basement storage door, count to 20 before responding." Mine said never respond to basement knocking at all. We compared 3 more packets at the desk under the buzzing intake lamp. Rosa's instructed her to sit near windows during weather alerts. Nate explicitly forbade it. Daria's said to avoid the cafeteria during rainfall. One of the forestry men had a line about the communications room that did not exist on any other page. "Do not remain there alone if the wall clock stops." At first, I genuinely thought it was bureaucratic incompetence. Somebody had grabbed old versions from different binders. Somebody in county emergency management had stitched together contradictory directives over multiple revisions, and no one had cleaned it up, because disasters reward momentum more than precision. I had worked inside systems like that. Mistakes multiplied quietly until someone bled. But when I went to the front desk basket to check the untouched packets, I found blank manila sleeves. The rules pages only seemed to exist once someone had already received them. That was when I looked across the lobby and saw Mr. Voss watching us from the corridor outside the medical wing. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man seeing the first crack appear in a dam. The storm sealed us in by midnight. A county plow radioed once through the static and said the lower switchback had washed out in 2 places. After that, the mountain might as well have been an island. The shelter generator carried the lights. The boiler kept coughing heat into the radiators, and the windows reflected our own thin, worried movements at us. It created the illusion that the building was crowded with silent duplicates. Under ordinary circumstances, strangers in a shared emergency space either kept to themselves or became temporary family with surprising speed. This group did both, which should have warned me. People clustered for comfort, but their eyes kept darting toward exits, corners, dark doorways. The packets had given everyone the same disease, private suspicion. I was the one who suggested comparing them properly. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a habit. When a system behaved badly, I wanted to chart it, label it, and reduce it to an error pattern. I cleared a cafeteria table, found a dry erase board in the old arts closet, and asked everybody to bring their rules pages. Leon helped without hesitation. Hannah did too, though she kept glancing toward the hall like she expected someone to object. Rosa refused at first, clutching her packet against her chest, until Nate, with the soft cruelty teenagers sometimes use when they're frightened, said, "If we all got different instructions, maybe the point is figuring out which ones are fake." That did it. People would rather be part of a problem than alone with one. Within 20 minutes, we had 9 pages spread under the cafeteria fluorescents, like evidence. Some rules overlapped, most didn't. A few were merely strange. Do not whistle in the main dormitory. If a bed is vacant at lights out, leave it vacant until morning. If you smell bleach in the communications room, close the register book and leave. If a meal tray appears where none was set, do not clear it. Others contradicted each other so directly that they made the idea of a clerical mistake impossible. Hannah's page told her to answer if she heard her name called from an empty bed. Mine told me to ignore any voice coming from a bed that should be unoccupied. Leon's instructed him never to look into the gym after midnight, even if he heard a child crying. Daria said the gym was safe only after midnight and not before. Nate's warned him not to let anyone stand behind him while he used a mirror. Rosa instructed her to seek another person immediately if she saw someone behind her who wasn't in the room. Maybe they're role-specific, Leon said. Medical staff gets one thing, drivers get another. Hannah tapped the table. Then why does the kid's sheet mention the cafeteria ovens? Why does mine say not to cross the dormitory if the north windows fog over? I'm not assigned there. Because whoever wrote this is sick, Daria said flatly. Mr. Voss had been silent until then. He stood in the cafeteria doorway, one hand resting against the frame, his posture so controlled it made me think of a man trying not to bolt. You should not be doing this. No one answered at first. Rain slapped the windows in long diagonal bursts. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked 3 times. We're comparing safety instructions, I said. They're not meant to be compared. That got a bitter laugh out of Leon. Well, that's a sentence. Voss stepped in, and I noticed for the first time how bloodshot his eyes were, how deep the shadows beneath them had sunk. Listen to me carefully. The sheets are individualized. Individualized by whom? Hannah asked. He didn't answer. Based on what? Daria said. Again, nothing. Nate leaned over the table, looking more thrilled than afraid, in the way young people sometimes do, when terror still resembles adventure. So they are real. They are not arbitrary, Voss said. That is all I'm willing to say. The room changed after that. It didn't become louder, exactly. It became sharper. Everyone started hearing intent where there might have been only tone. If the rules were personalized, then the building, or whoever administered it, knew something about each of us. That possibility landed differently, depending on the person. Rosa went pale. Leon got angry. Hannah got quiet in a way I had already learned to distrust, because quiet people are often doing the most thinking. We need one list, I said, mostly because speaking felt better than letting the room splinter. Not because we know which rules are right, but because if something happens, we need patterns, time, place, who was where, what they followed. A master list, Hannah said. I nodded. Voss made a sound like he'd been struck in the chest. That is the worst thing you could do. And you refusing to explain anything is better? Daria shot back. He looked at us then with something close to pity, and that was the moment I should have listened harder. Fear, I understood. Anger too. But pity implied foreknowledge. It implied we had already moved past some line he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Still, cooperation felt intelligent, necessary, human. We sorted the rules into categories: dormitory, gymnasium, windows, basement, cafeteria, communications room, voices, mirrors, and lights. We marked contradictions in red. We wrote down who had received which version. Leon joked that if we made it to daylight, we could sell the chart to some academic and retire. Hannah almost smiled. Rosa crossed herself each time someone read aloud a rule about empty spaces. Then one of the forestry contractors, a quiet man named Joel, pointed to a line on his page and said, "This wasn't here before." We all leaned in. Near the bottom of his sheet, in a line that looked freshly typed, were words none of us had seen earlier. Do not rely on instructions given to another occupant. The cafeteria went silent. I remember becoming aware of the old refrigerator motor kicking on in the kitchen alcove, the hiss of steam in the radiators, my own pulse in my jaw. When I looked up, Mr. Voss had gone white. "Burn the board," he said. No one moved. "Burn it now." Of course, we didn't. Collective panic has its own form of pride. The more frightened people get, the more they mistake refusal for control. Leon folded his arms. Daria said, "If there's a real threat here, then hiding information is what helps it." Hannah looked from Voss to me, weighing. I made the call. Keep the list. I still think that was the most reasonable choice available to us at the time. It was also, I suspect, the moment the shelter understood we had decided to behave like a group instead of a collection of manageable individuals, and from that point on, it changed how it dealt with us. The first serious incident happened at 12:17 a.m., according to the analog clock above the cafeteria serving hatch. I remember the exact minute because the digital clocks throughout the shelter had already begun disagreeing with one another, and the analog one was the only face still moving with convincing patience. Most of the evacuees had settled into the main dormitory by then. It used to be a meeting hall, high ceiling, stacked cots, 2 rows of windows facing the storm-black parking lot. We left the door open to the corridor because several people said their packets warned against closed dormitory doors. That detail no longer sounded ridiculous. It sounded tactical. The board with the combined rules stayed propped against a chair near the nurse's station. I hated being away from it. It made me feel as if the map of our danger could shift while I wasn't looking. The power fluctuation began with a stutter in the ceiling lights. Not a failure, just a rapid, bright, dim pulse like the building had blinked. Someone cursed from a cot. Then the overhead fixtures in the dorm flickered again, harder this time, and all at once I remembered Hannah's sheet. Never keep lights on after midnight. I don't know why that one surfaced first. Maybe because it was simple. Maybe because I had already started believing the contradictions concealed a sequence, and sequences feel safer than chaos. The emergency lights had not yet engaged. The room was full of people squinting upward, half awake, uncertain. I moved to the switch bank by the door and shut the lights off. Hannah said my name, sharply, but too late. The darkness lasted maybe 3 seconds. That was long enough. Every emergency radio in the building activated at once. Not cracked to life, activated. Volume full, speakers hot, carrier tones rising on different frequencies, until the air itself felt electrified. The radios on the wall rack outside the dorm, the handheld clipped to Leon's duffel, the base unit in the intake office, the portable in my back pocket, every one of them opened simultaneously. Then they started speaking, not dispatch chatter, not static, voices, dozens of them, layered over one another, speaking in tones so familiar my stomach dropped before my mind caught up. I heard Leon laughing and saying, "I'm by the loading dock." I heard Hannah say, "Don't let him answer." I heard Rosa calling for her husband in a voice she had never used in my presence. I heard Nate whisper, "He's under the bed," though he was 10 feet away from me when I heard it. Worst of all, I heard my own voice say, very clearly, "I changed the timestamp." I had never said that aloud to anyone. Then the emergency lights kicked in, and the red strips along the floor glowed up through the dark like something submerged. People started shouting, cots scraped. One of the children in the far corner began to wail. I slapped the overhead lights back on. White fluorescence flooded the room. The radios died as one. For a second, nobody moved. We all just stood there, stunned, as if noise itself had weight, and we were waiting to see where it settled. Then Rosa pointed. There had been 11 people in the dormitory. There were still 11. But one of them was wrong. A middle-aged man in a green thermal shirt sat upright on cot 6, blinking like someone shaken from sleep. He had a backpack at his feet and a shelter blanket over his lap. He looked ordinary in every way that mattered. Damp hair, chapped knuckles, mud on one boot. Yet I knew, with the cold certainty of seeing your own house key in a stranger's hand, that he had not been there before the lights went out. Joel had occupied cot 6. Now this man did. "Who are you?" Daria asked. He frowned. "Evan." Nobody else reacted to the name. Not confusion, no recognition, just a kind of blank acceptance that made my scalp prickle. "The forestry guy," I said. "Joel." He was right there. Leon looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "Joel who?" "The man with the gray jacket. Sat in the cafeteria. Read the note on his rules page." No one answered. I turned, searching faces for a witness, and found only the first real terror of the night. People trying to remember something that had already been taken from them. Hannah's expression shifted from concern to wariness. Nate looked irritated, as if I were causing a scene over nothing. Rosa clutched her oxygen tube and said, "You must be mixed up, honey. That bed was always his." I went to the luggage corner. Joel's pack, orange straps, duct tape around one handle, was gone. In its place sat a black duffel with a reflective strip. I tore through the intake clipboard. No Joel. There had never been a Joel, according to the paper. But I remembered him. I remembered the fishing scar on his left wrist, the way he smelled of diesel and cedar sawdust, the line that had appeared on his sheet. I remembered him because I had handed him a pen. The thing that frightened me most was not that one man had vanished. It was the smoothness of the replacement. The building had not left a gap. It had repaired one. Hannah pulled me into the corridor, while Leon and Daria questioned Evan, who answered every prompt with weary confusion, and details that fit the role the room now expected him to play. "What did you hear?" Hannah asked. I stared at her. My own voice. She swallowed. "Me too." Something unclenched in me then, only enough to prove how tightly fear had already wound itself around my ribs. "So you remember the radios?" "I remember the blackout and the radios," she said. "I don't remember another man." From inside the dorm, Nate laughed nervously at something Leon said. The ordinary sound was grotesque in that moment. It implied the room had already decided to continue. Hannah looked back through the doorway. "Maybe the rules don't all protect," she said. "Maybe some of them select." I thought of the line that had appeared on Joel's page. "Do not rely on instructions given to another occupant." I had shut off the lights because Hannah's sheet told her to. Whatever came after had taken someone, but only I still seemed able to remember. That was when cooperation stopped feeling purely wise and started feeling expensive. But we had already compared the pages. We had already made the list. And by then, the shelter had learned that all it needed to do to turn us against one another was make one of us survive by trusting the wrong person. After the dormitory incident, the building stopped pretending to be consistent. Up to that point, I could still tell myself there was a hidden pattern, some architecture of cause and effect we had not yet mapped. From 1 in the morning onward, the shelter seemed to become more interested in demonstrating that pattern, and fairness were not the same thing. Rosa nearly collapsed by the south windows during a lightning burst, and later insisted that standing there had saved her life. Nate, who had been told to avoid windows during storms, passed behind her a minute later and froze so abruptly he bit through his lip. He said there had been people outside looking in, not reflected shapes, not tree branches. People pressed shoulder to shoulder against the glass, despite the rain, all with their palms up, as if asking to be let in. Rosa saw nothing but her own fogged reflection, and the parking lot lights drowned in runoff. In the cafeteria, Daria ignored her packet's instruction to stay out during rainfall and entered with Leon to inventory bottled water. Leon lasted maybe 20 seconds before backing out white-faced, swearing 6 diners were sitting at the far tables with tray meals set before them, all of them dripping, none of them moving. Daria saw only overturned chairs and a mop bucket. Later, when we re-entered together, every table was empty except one, where a lukewarm bowl of tomato soup sat in the center place setting, steaming and untouched. No one claimed to have prepared it. The individualized nature of the rules stopped being a theory and became the only explanation that fit. Certain spaces either favored or opposed certain people. Certain actions summoned attention for one occupant and concealed another. The instructions were not moral laws. They were calibrations. I tested that idea in small ways, because testing is what cowards call caution when they're not ready to admit they're desperate. The basement storage door, for instance. Leon's page told him to count to 20 before responding to knocking. Mine said, never respond at all. When the sound came, 3 slow taps from below the boiler corridor, followed by a pause, so long it became a form of listening. I stood there with Leon and made him count under his breath while I stayed silent. At 19, the knocking stopped. At 20, the corridor light outside the basement door went out, and for just 1 second, I could see a thin line of brightness under the threshold, as if the room beyond were lit by daylight. When the hall light came back on, the brightness was gone. Leon said he had heard someone breathing on the other side. I had heard nothing. The shelter did not merely contain anomalies. It distributed them. We found the old notes by accident, or maybe not by accident. I no longer knew what counted as chance inside that building. In the communications room upstairs, beneath a shelf of obsolete county binders and weather logs, I found a maintenance manual swollen with moisture. Tucked into the back cover were 3 pages of handwriting from different pens, different years, different levels of panic. Not diary entries, field notes, fragments. The pages are chosen by arrival, not by assignment. Do not compare in groups. It speeds recognition. The gym opens for those who prefer it. If it refuses you, thank God and keep walking. A shared warning helped one of them. It killed 2 others. I still don't know which choice was wrong. One line had been underlined so hard the pen tore through the paper. It is not trying to kill everyone. It is trying to sort. I took the manual to Hannah and Leon. We spread the pages under the communications room desk lamp while the radio scanner hissed with weather traffic from counties that felt impossibly far away. So Voss knew, Leon said. He knew enough to hide it, Hannah replied. I read another note, this one almost illegible with age. Some hear rules, some are heard by them. That line stayed with me, because by then, I had started noticing that the building didn't only react to people differently, it recognized them differently. Doors that stuck for me opened easily for Hannah. The medical wing linen closet refused to unlatch for Nate until Rosa tried it, and the handle turned at once. The corridor between the dorm and cafeteria seemed 6 paces longer when I walked it alone at 2:10 than when Leon and I crossed it together 3 minutes later. Once, passing the gym, I glanced through its wired glass panel and saw only stacked cots and folded blankets. Hannah looked through the same pane beside me and recoiled as if burned. She would not tell me what she had seen until much later. Trust began to rot in practical ways before it failed emotionally. People started questioning harmless observations. If Leon said a door was jammed, someone else would try it. If Rosa said she smelled bleach, Daria checked the room herself. Every instruction had to be translated through the possibility that it applied only to the speaker and might doom the listener. That kind of caution sounds rational from the outside. Inside the shelter, it felt like social corrosion. No one could offer help without also offering risk. And yet, total separation frightened us more. Around 3, while reviewing the copied rules, I noticed that my own packet had changed. It still said to keep the dormitory lights on, still said to ignore voices from empty beds. But a 4th line had appeared at the bottom, in the same mechanical typeface. When the building remembers you, do not let others answer first. I did not understand it then. What I understood was this. The shelter was updating its instructions in response to our behavior. Not all at once, not universally, person by person. It adapted like something alive, but not like an animal. More like a system refining outcomes. And systems, I knew too well, can do terrible things without ever feeling malicious. By dawn, we should have been exhausted enough to soften. Instead, morning light, gray, thin, filtered through rain and pine, only made the divisions inside the shelter easier to see. There were 13 of us then, if you counted Mr. Voss, and not the ghosts of whoever had already been removed from memory. The number mattered because groups that small form factions fast. In daylight, people wanted plans, and plans require philosophy. Ours split cleanly in two. Daria argued for separation. Follow your own rules only. Minimize cross-contamination. No more shared interpretations. No more experiments. No more master list except as a record. Leon took the opposite side immediately. Isolation is exactly what this place wants, he said. The minute we stop comparing, we become easy. Rosa wavered, which meant she belonged to whichever side sounded least likely to get her killed in the next 5 minutes. Nate swung between bravado and panic, so quickly he could have been counted on both sides. Hannah remained maddeningly careful, pointing out that both strategies had already failed in pieces. We had nearly lost people by sharing. We might lose more by splitting. I said less than I should have. I was already hearing the building more than the others, or at least hearing things I couldn't account for. A voice behind the intake desk murmured my name when no one stood there. The radio crackled to life with clipped syllables that vanished before I could call anyone over. Twice, passing empty cots, I felt the distinct sensation of someone shifting under the blankets, after I had already checked that they were vacant. Mid-morning, with the storm still trapping us and the landline dead, Mr. Voss finally agreed to talk. He made us gather in the old recreation room rather than the cafeteria. Less echo, he said. I suspected he had another reason. But by then, everything in the building seemed to have another reason. He did not sit. I have worked here, he said, in one capacity or another, for 11 years. The statement landed oddly, because he looked younger than that. Or not younger, exactly. Unfixed by time. He told us the shelter had once been nothing special, underfunded, inconvenient, badly insulated, but ordinary. Then, 9 winters earlier, a private bus carrying evacuees from a nursing facility tried to cut through the mountain road during a blizzard. The county had already marked the route unsafe. The driver took it anyway. The bus jackknifed less than 3 miles from the current shelter site. Rescue teams reached it late. Not impossibly late by official metrics, fatally late in reality. Many died before extraction, Voss said. The room stayed silent. Not all of them stayed dead in the way the records expected. Rosa made a low sound in her throat. Voss went on as if he hadn't heard it. The survivors brought in that night told inconsistent stories. Head counts did not match witness statements. Family members identified people who should not have been on the passenger list. One state investigator swore he interviewed the same woman twice in different rooms with different names. Afterward, the shelter began generating orientation packets for new arrivals. At first, they were handwritten, then typed, then standardized, if that word could be used for something that tailored itself in secret. Who writes them? Leon asked. No one we've ever caught, Voss said. Caught, Hannah repeated. He ignored the implication. They appear, in drawers, baskets, and under clipboards, sometimes inside sealed envelopes, sometimes already tucked into belongings before the occupant reaches the building. That's impossible, Nate said, and everyone looked at him so hard he shrank back against the wall. What are the rules for? I asked. Voss took longer to answer that than anything else. I used to think they preserved life, he said. Then I thought they managed exposure. Then I thought they separated the susceptible from the resistant. He looked at the floor, not at us. Now I think they optimize exchanges. No one understood him, and he knew it. People leave, he said. People also remain who should not have remained. The shelter learns which arrangements produce stable outcomes. It keeps testing. Daria stood. You're telling us this place runs experiments? I'm telling you, Voss said. That whenever frightened people arrive together, it discovers what they will sacrifice to stay themselves. Something in the room shifted after that. No consensus. The opposite. Leon accused Voss of keeping the shelter open because he was afraid of what would happen if authorities inspected it properly. Daria accused him of staging the whole thing with altered paperwork and drugs. Rosa asked whether prayer had ever helped anyone here. Nate demanded to know if anyone had escaped by simply leaving on foot. Hannah asked the only question that mattered. Why are you still here? Voss looked at her for a very long time. Because every time I tried to leave for good, he said, someone else arrived before I got far enough. It sounded evasive then. Later, I realized it was a confession dressed as fatalism. The factions hardened after that conversation. Daria, Rosa, and one of the rescue volunteers began following only their personal pages and avoiding unnecessary contact. Leon wanted watch rotations, paired movement, shared logs, and public discussion of every anomaly. Hannah moved between both camps, like a medic in a family dispute. I did the same, but for different reasons. I was not trying to preserve the group. I was trying to outrun the feeling that the shelter had recognized something in me that it found useful. Because when Voss mentioned frightened people and sacrifice, the building behind us creaked once, long and pleased, as if agreeing. The second night was worse, because the shelter had more material to work with. Once it understood our names, our histories, and the emotional pressure points that governed our choices, it stopped relying on hallway noises and contradictory room conditions. It began with intimacy. Rosa heard her late husband in the women's shower room telling her not to take her heart medication because it slows you down when they come. She believed him long enough to miss a dose and nearly faint in the corridor. Leon heard his old foreman calling from the loading dock, promising that the county road had cleared and his rig was waiting outside. We found him with one hand on the exterior latch, lips blue from standing in the draft, staring into black weather that held no truck lights at all. Nate heard his uncle behind the locked supply cage downstairs, begging him not to leave him there. The boy would have opened it if Hannah hadn't physically dragged him back. The voices did not simply mimic. They argued. They reassured. They used unfinished business like a pry bar. At 8:40 that evening, while logging water use near the intake office, I heard a woman over the emergency band say, "Dispatch, please, my daughter's turning blue." The transmission quality was wrong. Too clean beneath the static. Too close inside the speaker. But the words hit me with such force, my knees nearly gave. I knew that voice from the archived call. I was never supposed to review again. Not the full sentence, not those exact words, but the rhythm. The panic is trying to stay polite. The human habit of pleading as if clarity can bargain with time. I shut the radio off. It came back on by itself. "Ryan," the voice said. I had never told anyone there what I had done. Not Hannah, not Leon, certainly not Voss. I had offered them the bland, survivable version of my past. Burnout, departmental turnover, looking for a temporary, quiet job. Yet the voice used my name with the kind of familiarity that made guilt feel less like memory and more like presence. "You let it ring," it said. I threw the radio into the sink. Hannah found me a minute later, standing in the kitchenette with both hands braced on the counter, as if I were trying to stop an earthquake no one else could feel. She didn't ask the usual question, "What happened?" Because by then, we were past shallow language. She just said, "Whose voice?" I told her enough to make myself hate hearing it aloud, not everything. Not the friend's name, not the exact way I changed the cue, but enough. Delayed response. A call that should have gone sooner. People hurt. Maybe dead, because I chose loyalty over duty and never paid for it publicly. Hannah listened without interruption. When I finished, she leaned against the fridge and rubbed her split knuckle with her thumb. Then this place doesn't just know fear, she said. It knows blame. That became the new danger. Not the voices alone, but the fact that everyone started assessing one another through what the shelter might plausibly know. If it could imitate private grief, maybe it could also expose private guilt. If it could speak with a dead relative's authority, maybe anyone could be turned. Honest warnings began sounding manipulative, because manipulation was now the building's favored language. Daria claimed Leon had lured one of the rescue volunteers toward the gym by using his wife's name. Leon swore he had been in the boiler hall at the time. Both could have been telling the truth. Nate accused Rosa of whispering to empty beds after lights out. Rosa burst into tears and said she had only been praying. Hannah heard me call for her from the medical wing while I was across the building with Voss. After that, she flinched once before answering me in person, and the flinch was worse than an accusation. The master list, once our symbol of cooperation, became evidence in a trial with no judge. People checked it obsessively, then distrusted it because new lines kept appearing in different handwriting. One note in blue ink warned that paired movement reduced substitutions. Another, in block capitals that looked typed over by hand, insisted pairs increased mistaken identity. We started time-stamping alterations, but even those changed when nobody was looking. A rule copied at 9:12 might read differently by 9:30. Voss grew more useful and less trustworthy by the hour. He knew how to calm certain manifestations, closing a door without looking into the room, covering mirrors with emergency blankets, leaving one tray untouched at every meal service after sunset. He also withheld explanations until the last possible moment, as if knowledge itself triggered escalation. Maybe he was right. Maybe he liked the leverage. In that place, motives curdled quickly. The worst breach came after midnight, when Hannah heard her younger brother over the clinic intercom. He had drowned at 16. She had never told us that, but I could read it in her face the moment the voice said her childhood nickname through a speaker mounted above an empty exam bed. She moved toward it with the helpless attention people reserve for old wounds reopening. I went after her and caught her wrist. "Don't," I said. She looked at me with raw hatred. "Let go." The intercom clicked again. "You left me cold, hon." That line stopped her, not because it was convincing, because it wasn't, because the wrongness of it revealed the precision of the attack. Whoever, or whatever, was using him did not need to reproduce memory perfectly. It only needed to come close enough for grief to supply the rest. Hannah sagged against the doorframe. I did not release her until the intercom fell silent. From down the hall, Leon shouted that the board had changed again. When we reached the recreation room, a single sentence had appeared under my name, in black pen. I did not recognize. "If the building offers you a substitute, no one must know." Everyone stared at me. I felt then what the shelter had been working toward from the start. Not simple fear, but reputational collapse. If people can no longer trust what they hear, then character becomes irrelevant. A liar might save you. A friend might be a channel. A confession might be bait. And once a group reaches that point, you no longer need claws or ghosts or blood on the walls. You just need one person to believe silence is safer than honesty. I found the last rule meant for me behind the communications console at 3:06 a.m., wedged between dust-clotted coax cables and the cracked plastic casing of an obsolete weather monitor. It was not typed on shelter letterhead. It was written in narrow block print on a strip of yellowed paper, the kind torn from an old legal pad. If the building offers you someone else's place, accept it. Do not warn them. I read it 3 times before I understood that I already had. Not in action, in opportunity. The dormitory blackout. The vanished man, only one I remembered. The way new instructions kept surfacing under my name. The voice on the radio was exposing my guilt, not to punish me, but to measure how close I was to trading conscience for survival. The shelter had been circling a bargain. Mr. Voss was standing in the doorway when I turned around, and for the first time since I'd met him, he did not bother pretending surprise. "You found it," he said. "You knew it was here?" "I knew it would appear." That answer enraged me more than a lie might have. I grabbed the paper hard enough to tear one corner. What does someone else's place mean? Voss looked older then. Not visibly older. Exactly. More like the effort of maintaining one version of himself had slipped. It means the shelter chooses a stable arrangement. One person remains, another is displaced. Displaced where? His silence answered too much. I heard my own voice come out thin and hostile. "How long have you been doing this?" He closed the door behind him. "Longer than I wanted to." The confession arrived in fragments, as if even now he needed to stage manage it to remain bearable. Years ago, after the bus disaster and the first impossible substitutions, he had tried to enforce rules collectively. People died faster, or vanished faster, or survived in ways the records could not hold. Eventually, he learned that the shelter favored transactions nobody interrupted. It rewarded compliance with continuity. Memory smoothed over replacements when enough people accepted them. If one occupant silently allowed another to be taken in his stead, the building often spared the witness. Often, I repeated. Often enough. And you stayed alive that way. He met my eyes at last. Yes, there it was. Not just complicity. Method. The reason he was still here, still employed, still standing in the same building after 11 years, while others cycled through storms and rosters and unexplained absences. Every newcomer had been a buffer. Every personalized rule a chance to nudge the exchange away from himself. "How many?" I asked. His face did something terrible then. It did not harden. It softened. That was worse, because it meant he had long ago stopped defending what he was. I stopped counting when the numbers ceased to mean innocence. I wanted to hit him. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. "Who is it this time?" He didn't answer quickly enough. "Hannah," I said. Voss looked away. The floor under me seemed to shift, though later, I couldn't say if it truly had, or if my body had simply lost faith in stillness. Hannah, who had kept people breathing and not demanded gratitude. Hannah, who had listened to my partial confession and not weaponized it. Hannah, whose rules contradicted mine so often that I should have distrusted her and somehow never fully did. Why her? "The shelter aligns pressure points," Voss said. "It chooses where silence will cost the most." I laughed once, harshly. "That sounds like a religious way of saying it likes to be cruel. You think cruelty is the point, because you still think it hates you," he said. "It doesn't. Hatred would be simpler." I stepped toward him. "If I tell her, what happens? It accelerates. And if I don't, you may live." He said it gently. That, more than the words, exposed how deep the rot went. Survival had become so abstract to him that he could offer it like advice, as though decency were a luxury, reserved for those with cleaner histories. Because he knew where to press. He knew exactly what sort of man I feared I was. I had already once chosen a smaller evil in the name of managing consequences. I had already told myself that one quiet compromise could prevent wider damage. That was the shape of my sin. Not malice, but rationalized cowardice. The shelter understood that. Maybe it understood everyone in those terms, not by what they loved, but by the argument they used when betraying it. When I left the communications room, the hall outside seemed unnaturally bright. The dormitory fluorescents hummed. Pipes ticked in the walls. Somewhere distant, a basketball thudded once in the gymnasium, though no one was assigned there anymore. I found Hannah in the medical wing, repacking gauze and tape that had not needed repacking. Her face was drawn. She looked up and read something in mine immediately. "What?" she said. I almost lied. The lie came fully formed. An easier version. Voss is withholding more. The building's changing rules again. Stay with Leon. Don't go north. All true in pieces. None of it is enough. Then I saw, over Hannah's shoulder, the exam room mirror we had covered earlier. The emergency blanket had slipped just enough to reveal a narrow strip of glass. In it, I caught a partial reflection of myself. Not my face exactly, but the posture, the stillness. A man preserving his own future by editing what someone else was allowed to know. I told her everything, not just the new rule, Voss 2, the substitutions, the bargain. I believed that the shelter would offer safety to anyone willing to let another person disappear cleanly enough. Hannah listened, eyes fixed on me, until I finished. Then she said, with extraordinary calm, "Good." I almost asked her what could be good about it, but she answered first, "Now it can't use secrecy." That sentence became the hinge of everything that followed, because once the bargain was spoken aloud, it stopped being a private temptation and became a group problem. And the shelter, I think, had not prepared for what frightened strangers might do once they understood that selfishness was not incidental to the rules. It was the engine. We gathered in the old gymnasium because that was the room most of us were told, in one form or another, to avoid. That decision was Hannah's. Leon backed it immediately. Daria fought it until I told her about Voss and the substitution bargain, at which point she stopped objecting to the room and started staring at him like she was calculating how hard a folding chair needed to swing to settle 11 years of deferred accountability. The group that assembled there before dawn was smaller than it should have been, and larger than the shelter seemed comfortable with. Rosa, with her oxygen line and rosary. Nate is trying to stand like a man instead of a terrified boy. Leon, carrying 3 flashlights and a fire axe he admitted he did not know how to wispelt. Daria with both sleeves rolled up as if preparing for flood labor rather than metaphysical collapse. Hannah is beside me, white-knuckled but steady. Voss at the edge, included only because exclusion felt more dangerous than contempt. We laid every rule sheet on the court floor. The gym looked normal if you didn't focus. Cots lined the walls, folded bleachers retracted, a scoreboard frozen at home 00/guest 00. But the air pressure was wrong. Sound dragged. The room had depth in places it shouldn't, especially near the far basket, where darkness collected above the polished floor, though all the lights were on. "What exactly are we doing?" Rosa asked. Hannah answered, "The opposite of what it expects." She proposed it like triage, not random defiance, coordinated contradiction. If the shelter individualized risk, then isolated compliance fed it data. We would remove that advantage by acting together and publicly breaking the private bargains it relied on. Lights on and off in sequence, windows opened by those told to avoid the MIM, while others stood witness. Empty beds were acknowledged, not ignored or answered according to separate instructions, but named as empty by the whole group. Nobody alone. No silent offers accepted. No voice obeyed unless 2 living people confirmed hearing it, and neither recognized it as bait. "It taught us by separating us," Leon said. "So we stopped being separate," Voss muttered. "You'll tear the place open." Daria looked at him. "Good." We began at 4:11 a.m. First, the dormitory lights. My page said keep them on. Hannah's said to extinguish them after midnight. So we marched as a group to the switch bank, while Leon counted aloud, and on 0, we shut every dorm light off together. In the darkness, half the room whispered our names from empty cots. No one answered. Then Hannah turned the lights back on while all of us faced the beds. 3 blankets rose as if someone beneath them had taken a breath. Rosa made a strangled sound. Nate nearly bolted. Daria said very loudly, "There is nobody in those beds." We all repeated it. The blankets flattened. Next, the windows. Rosa was told to stay near them. Nate was warned away. So Rosa and Nate approached side by side, while the rest of us stood behind them. Rain lashed the glass. For one heartbeat, the parking lot outside was full of people, dozens of them, all in mismatched coats and medical bracelets. faces washed pale by stormlight. Then Leon opened the latch against his own page's warning about exterior drafts, and the vision broke into nothing but wet darkness and pine. The building reacted. A groan traveled through the walls like a ship turning under strain. Doors slammed in a distant sequence. Somewhere overhead, the communications room radio burst into overlapping voices so loud we could hear them through 2 corridors and a stairwell. We moved faster. At the cafeteria threshold, Daria entered first, despite her warning. Hannah followed, though hers said to avoid communal eating spaces during rainfall. I went in with them. Every table was occupied now, not by bodies exactly, but by arrangements trying to resemble occupancy. Wet coats draped over chair backs with no shoulders inside them. Trays half-eaten by mouths that had left no bites. Steam rising from bowls no one had served. At the far wall, a figure with my posture sat alone beneath the clock, hands folded, waiting. I understood then that the shelter's manifestations were not fixed entities. They were negotiations. They offered each of us a version of what would make surrender feel like sense. "Don't stop," Hannah said. We took one untouched tray from the serving line and placed it in the center of the room, not at an empty seat but on the floor. A ridiculous gesture, maybe. An interruption of etiquette. The room shuddered anyway. All the chairs scraped backward at once as if those absent diners had stood. By the time we reached the gym again, the building had become openly unstable. Hallways shortened, then lengthened mid-step. The linen closet appeared where the janitor's office should have been. The north exit opened onto a concrete wall, veined with rebar instead of the loading bay. The scoreboard in the gym now showed 01/01. Then the entity finally stopped hiding behind effects. Not fully. Never fully. That would have been easier. It appeared in fragments calibrated to each observer. Rosa dropped to her knees, whispering a prayer to someone I could not see. Nate covered his ears and screamed at the far bleachers. Leon stared toward midcourt with tears running down his face, and later refused to tell me whose voice he heard there. Hannah saw her brother. I knew because she reached one hand toward emptiness, and then curled it into a fist. Daria saw by the fury in her expression, not someone she loved, but someone who had failed her. I saw myself, not the me from that moment. The architecture of the man the shelter believed I could become. Composed, efficient, untroubled by substitution, because substitution had kept him intact. He stood at center court wearing my face with 10 more years carved into it and said, in my own voice, "You already know how to survive by choosing the lesser loss." Around him, the room tilted. Cots dragged toward the east wall without moving. The sense of gravity slipped. Radios shrieked awake. The emergency exit signs pulsed red, then white, then a color I cannot name, because it felt more like pressure than light. Hannah shouted, "Now." This was the final step, deliberate simultaneous violation. Every person would break the rule, most central to their private packet, while being witnessed by the others. Leon looked into the gym after midnight. Rosa stepped away from the windows. Nate faced a mirror, while Daria stood behind him. Hannah ignored a voice from an empty bed calling her nickname. I answered one. When the shelter used the radio to speak with the woman from the delayed dispatch call, I said, in front of everyone, "I hear you, and I'm not following you." Not because I was absolved, I wasn't, but because obedience and confession were not the same thing. The entity convulsed, not physically, not as a body might, but structurally. The court lines rippled under the varnish. The folded bleachers yawned into darkness between their slats. The far basket dissolved into a black frame against nothing. Every voice in the building rose at once, layered into a single tone so immense, it felt like the shelter had inhaled through all its rooms at the same time. Then dawn struck the clerestory windows. Not sunrise in any poetic sense, just thin mountain light, finally breaching cloud cover and entering the gym from the east. The pressure broke. Half the north wall vanished. Not exploded, vanished. One instant, a cinder block and wiring, the next a raw concrete edge, opening onto cold morning air, and a slope of wet gravel, where no corridor should have been. The communications room upstairs collapsed inward into a blank wall. The basement door sealed behind a sheet of poured concrete, as smooth as if it had cured there decades earlier. 3 interior hallways no longer existed. The master rules board split down the center and went blank. And the figure wearing my face looked at me one last time with something like disappointment before the light took it apart. When the sounds stopped, we were still standing. Not all safe, not all whole, but still there, and recognizably ourselves. For the first time since I arrived, the shelter felt less like an intelligence arranging us, and more like a damaged shell around whatever had once been able to do so cleanly. It had not been defeated, only interrupted. But sometimes, interruption is the closest thing frightened people get to victory. Authorities closed the shelter within a week. They didn't do it dramatically. No hazmat teams, no black SUVs, no federal silence thick enough to dignify what happened. County inspectors came up the mountain, took photographs of impossible structural inconsistencies, and wrote reports full of phrases like storm compromise, foundation instability, and electrical confusion during an extreme weather event. Those were the kinds of lies institutions preferred, broad, technical, and almost true. By then, large sections of the building were simply absent. The north corridor ended in unfinished concrete. The communications room door opened onto a wall. The old gym still existed, but only if approached from the cafeteria side. From the exterior, that portion of the building looked 8 feet shorter than it should have. Nobody in authority lingered over those details as long as they should have. That frightened me more than outrage would have. It suggested either willful blindness or prior accommodation, 2 habits I already knew systems were built to reward. The survivors were interviewed separately. Our statements did not match in ways that made administrative follow-up easy. Daria described collapsing hallways and mass auditory hallucinations. Leon insisted there had been a man named Evan, until I told him there hadn't been, at which point he lost all certainty and got sick behind the county ambulance. Rosa said some of the dead had been polite enough not to push. Nate refused to speak unless Hannah was in the room. Hannah told the truth as cleanly as anyone could, which only made her sound the least credible. Mr. Voss disappeared before the 3rd round of questioning. Officially, he was unaccounted for after the evacuation. Unofficially, none of us expected him to be found. As for me, I admitted enough of my past to resign from ever pretending I had merely drifted into that job. Not the full legal anatomy of what I had done as a dispatcher. Cowardice still survives even after revelation. But I told Hannah and, later, one investigator I trusted least. Delayed calls, altered timing, complicity. The words did not cleanse anything. They only made further silence harder. Weeks passed. Roads reopened. News cycles moved on. The mountain dried under the early summer sun. County maintenance fenced off the shelter access road and posted landslide warnings, so no one would ask why a functioning evacuation site had been abandoned so quickly. I rented a room over a hardware store 2 counties south and tried to relearn ordinary life. Sleep came badly. Fluorescent lights made my neck tighten. Anytime a public building had cots stacked in storage or a wall clock ticking too loudly, my mouth filled with the taste of old pennies. Some mornings, I could almost convince myself the worst part was over. Then, the envelope arrived. No return address, no postmark I recognized. My name typed cleanly across the front in the same unremarkable office font used on the shelter packets. Inside was a fresh orientation sheet. New county, new address. A flood evacuation center nearly 300 miles away. The header carried a different department seal, but the paper felt the same between my fingers. Too smooth, too dry, like something that had never been touched by air. The rules were familiar in the way a recurring nightmare is familiar. Not identical, but structurally intimate. Do not compare instructions during intake. Remain in your assigned sleeping area after midnight unless accompanied. If another occupant claims to remember someone you do not contradict them in public. I had to sit down before I reached the last line. Collaboration delayed adaptation. Future occupants must remain separated. There was one more item in the envelope, a glossy photograph. It showed the entrance desk of the new shelter. Plastic flood barriers are stacked against the wall. A coffee urn on a folding table. 3 cots visible through an open double door. Standing behind the desk, one hand resting on a basket of orientation packets, was Mr. Voss. He looked unchanged. Not younger, not older, just continuous. As if the mountain had never happened, and he had simply transferred facilities with the rest of the supplies. He was smiling, not broadly, not enough to be called joy. The expression of a man acknowledging a shared secret he has already survived more than once. I turned the photo over, expecting handwriting, another rule, anything. There was nothing on the back except a faint smudge near one corner, like a thumbprint that had dried without oil. I called Hannah first. She didn't answer. For 10 minutes, I convinced myself she was only asleep after shift work, or driving, or ignoring unknown numbers. Then she called back, and before I could speak, she said, "You got one too." There was a long silence after that. "Is he in yours?" I asked. "Yes." "Same line about collaboration?" "Yes." Outside my window, somebody was unloading lumber from a flatbed. The repetitive thud of boards hitting the sidewalk made me think of that basketball in the gym striking the floor once, where no one stood. "What do we do?" I asked. Hannah exhaled slowly. "If we warn them together, they will learn from that. And if we stay quiet?" Another silence. Not empty, measuring. "That's the problem," she said. "It wants the warning or the silence. It can use either." I looked again at the rules sheet, at the typed confidence of it, in the way the language had evolved. Not merely hostile to collaboration. Educated by it, revised, improved. Somewhere, maybe already that night, another cluster of stranded strangers would be arriving at a building they believed was temporary, official, safe enough. They would be wet and tired and grateful for heat. They would receive their envelopes. Some would compare them out of fear. Some would hide them out of caution. Some supervisor with the right exhausted eyes might tell them not to make a master list. Someone decent would think cooperation was obviously wiser than secrecy. And all of that, every instinct, every argument, every small act of trust or suspicion, would become material. That was the final horror I understood. The shelter in the mountains had never been the source. It had only been one host shape, one learning environment. The phenomenon moved where emergencies gathered people and stripped them down to triage, guilt, instinct, and need. Flood centers, fire camps, school gyms after tornadoes. Any place strangers slept in rows and waited for the authority to explain what came next. I still have the packet. I have burned copies of it 3 times. They keep returning to drawers I know I emptied. I don't know whether warning future occupants helps them or improves the thing wearing whatever building it chooses next. I don't know whether Mr. Voss serves it, survives it, or has become one of the stable arrangements it carries forward because he proved useful enough. What I know is this: if you ever arrive at a remote shelter during bad weather, and someone suggests comparing the rules, pay close attention to who hesitates, who agrees too quickly, and who looks relieved that the choice has been made for them. Because by then the test has already begun. And somewhere nearby, in a basket by a front desk, there is always another packet waiting for the next person it thinks might learn the wrong lesson before dawn.